Good morning. So today my topic is where to go from here, how to plan post-assessment. So what I'm going to talk about is when a lot of times my assessments don't go as I want them to, and how I adjust my lesson plans to make sure that my students progress, but also how do I continue to push my students who have reached the goals that I have set for them. My name is Maris Hawkins. I am an elementary and middle school Spanish teacher at Capitol Hill Day School. I'm part of the podcast team at We Teach Languages, and I'm a co-author of the book Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom. That was just released this spring. And I'm also part of the Pearl Summer Institute series. So I'm doing a session later this summer on how to move learners from input to output. So what do formative assessments look like in my classroom? So many times my assessments look like an IPA, but what am I doing in the middle to assess my students, and then how do I adjust my lessons so my students are ready for the IPA? One thing with presentational is we will do journal writings, or just a 5-minute writing. And this is a journal writing that I did with a gratitude journal, and that was from Samara. And that was a big part of the presentational part that I worked on with my students in middle school. Also, we'll do a lot of co-constructed writing activities where I'm summarizing on the board and students are telling me what to write, and then I'm helping them. I'm sometimes saying like, okay, we've used this word a lot already. What are some other words that we can use? Or I'm saying, okay, these are 2 sentences. How can we join them together? So by making students more aware of this, of what I'm thinking about when I'm writing and how they can think about it as well. For interpersonal, we will do paired speaking activities. So this can be students working with a partner, and it goes from structured, where I'm giving them some questions. They might be thinking of their own questions, and then they're practicing answering it, to less structured, where I'm giving them a topic, and they're thinking of ways that they're answering it and also coming up with all the questions. Also, I will do a teacher-directed class conversation. I think both the co-constructed writing activities and the class conversations and some of the other things we're going to talk about give students a way to see what other people are doing, which also inspires them to change what they're doing and maybe add more details, things like that. Student reflection on both interpersonal and presentational activities. How do they feel about what they can do? What was difficult for them? I think that's really valuable. And what helped them? What activities or assessments did we do that helped them? And then also doing interpretive activities. So sometimes it's just, looking at an activity of text, a video, and answering questions about it. Other times we use tech tools such as Pear Deck, quizzes, and Edpuzzle. Another thing that I like to do when we're doing an interpretive activity that's actually in the book is, for example, if it's an infographic and students are looking at it, I'll take out some facts, and they either have to match them back up to make sure that they that they answer the question, or I'll leave a blank and students have to predict what goes in the blank. So sometimes, for example, we were looking at people who are Spanish speakers in the United States and where they're from. And so they were matching, for example, the percentages with the different countries. I like that because we can do that all in the target language. The last thing that I like to do a lot of is interpretive games. And Anne-Marie Chase has a ton of interpretive games on her blog, and I will provide a link to that in the handout, because she is the queen of games, and so many games that my students really love, and they are not tech related, which I think in this day and age, we're excited to step away from the computer. They're amazing. And so I can turn any assessment into a game with things like the Lucky Reading game and things like that. So as I'm looking at what my students are doing, these are some things that I notice about my interpretive assessments where students might struggle. So the first thing, sometimes they have trouble identifying the main idea. And if they can't get the main idea, they're really not going to get much else. And as I've done more and more, mostly this goes away, but none of us are perfect. Sometimes I give a reading activity and my students have no clue what the main idea is. Also, sometimes they have trouble connecting the supporting details to the main idea. So they might have a ton of details that they know are true, but it's not related to the main idea. And we want to make sure that supporting details are supporting the main idea. Sometimes they have difficulty identifying the correct keywords or identifying the audience. And then finally, sometimes they have trouble with some context clues. So what do I do when I notice that my students are having trouble with some of this with interpretive? A lot of times it's really just revisiting the video or text as a whole class. And where was the disconnect? The one thing I really like about Edpuzzle is you can go back to the specific video section and see, and they can listen to the part just before, and then you can look at the question. The other thing that I like about Edpuzzle and that I highly recommend you do before all of this is you can do an Edpuzzle as a whole class, and they can listen to the video and you can re-listen when they're having trouble and you can point out the parts for them. Also, sometimes I realize I haven't planned enough pre-reading or listening tasks and activities. So sometimes I have to go back to the beginning and think about that. Or sometimes when I think, okay, the next time I'm doing this, I need to make sure I'm focusing on these pre-reading and listening tasks. So one thing is looking at other text features. So for an infographic, an article, that can be the title, that can be the subtitles. A lot of times students just read right over those when that contains a lot of important information about what the following paragraphs will include. Looking at pictures, looking at the captions and things like that ahead of time before you even look at the actual text. Also, doing some retrieval practice, like looking at that title, what are some things what are some words or facts that you think might be part of the text or part of the video? And also reviewing questions before the text or before the video. So sometimes students did understand what was going on, but maybe they just didn't understand the question. So making sure that the students do understand the questions before you even look at the text can be really valuable. Also, if you've gone over these questions, you don't just want to ask students to redo all of the same questions again. So sometimes I like to revisit the text with a new graphic organizer. And so that gives them a reason to go back and reread or rewatch some of this. On my blog, I've shared a couple of graphic organizers that I use. I've converted these to Jamboard, but you can use any of these graphic organizers on your own. And a lot of times they have PDF versions online. So then what do I notice about any interpersonal task that my students completed? So sometimes they have trouble elaborating with the details. And so with this, they are just stating fact after fact after fact, or they're doing statement after statement after statement. So, what did you do this weekend? I went to the market. I went to my soccer game. I went to the pool, but not actually saying, I went to the farmer's market and I bought a lot of fruits. I bought fruits because I was making a salad, things like that. Are they just doing statement after statement after statement? Because then they're not actually reaching up to that intermediate level that you want novices to be to be reaching for when they're ready. Or sometimes they have difficulty circling around unknown words. So instead of being able to start describing something, they just break down and speak in English. And then asking follow-up questions. Sometimes I notice that my students will always ask, why? And of course, yes, that helps the other student to explain, but that's not how we have a real conversation. So like, what actual follow-up questions make sense that they can ask? And then finally, sometimes the answer doesn't match up with the actual question. So, you ask about, where your students went, and they said, what time they went, and you try to kind of circle back, and they're still unable to answer the actual question that you've asked. So there was a breakdown in communication there. So here's some of the next plans that I do with interpersonal when I notice that they've had some difficulty, or again, that like they've done it, but maybe they can do even more the next time. The first thing that I like to do is circumlocution games, and these are always really fun for my students. One of them that you can do is the headbands activity, where they have a word that the other student has to describe to them. There's the pyramid game, where they have a lot of different words and the whole class is trying to describe them to them, or you can split them up into teams. Again, just making sure that having students are trying to explain a word that other students, that someone doesn't know. The other thing that I think is important is also that I'm modeling this. So maybe I haven't even really spent that much time on circumlocution, so my students won't be able to do it. So one thing that I like to do is kind of a version of the fly swatter. And so essentially what happens is I write down a lot of different words from a unit in Spanish, which is the language that I'm teaching in the target language. Then I give that sheet of paper, I give one to each pair of students. Then I'm describing the word in Spanish, and they're rushing to circle or draw a line through and beat their partner to be the first one. I will say that this gets intense. So sometimes I say, just give each person a point. You both got it almost at the same time. Another thing that I would say about that is it also engages everyone when everyone has a piece of paper. And then at the end, maybe you have a student that feels confident that they can explain what one of those words are. And then you're starting to transfer to let them take more ownership of it. Also doing some guessing games, 2 truths and 1 lie, where students are talking about what they've done and people are guessing the lie. And then after that, the student, like with the lie, you could ask them either follow-up questions about the truths that they wrote or the lie. The other thing that you could do with this is using this after an interpretive activity, and then it goes back to looking back at the interpretive that they've done. And the reason that this is good is, again, when I'm reading the sentences, they're practicing their listening skills. So sometimes, a lot of times with interpersonal, it's maybe not even the breakdown of what the students can say, it's a breakdown in what they can understand. Doing interview activities. And so this is a lot of times we'll have kind of one student that gets to go up, and I'm asking them questions about their life, about what they did on the weekend, about the unit that we're talking about. And then I can ask them follow-up questions as they're up there. And again, then students are hearing what those follow-up questions are. And then sometimes they can ask their own follow-up questions once they become more comfortable with that. Another thing is sometimes people will do hot seat, and the teacher will be on the hot seat, and the students will be asking questions of the teacher. And again, even if you're in the hot seat, you can tell them like, I'm not going to answer another question until someone asks me a follow-up question about what I've said, to really prompt them to think like, how much can we ask about this topic before we go on to something else? Which then they're hearing you elaborate on your answers as well. Sometimes it's just doing low key question activities like a quiz trade. So especially when students are just starting to get used to asking questions, having them partner with someone and then they trade their question, and then they're the expert on that question, and they can help someone else if they don't know what they're doing. The kind of the part that I make sure that I do at the end is whatever question at the end they have, they give it to me and then they answer it to me, and then I can ask them follow-up questions or make sure that they've understood what the question is. Then the other thing, sometimes with interpersonal, sometimes students aren't ready for our interpersonal task that we come up with. The answer to that is not more interpersonal. A lot of times it's more input, it's more listening, and it's more reading. So maybe they're not ready because they don't know the vocabulary in order to sustain it. Also, maybe our task was too difficult, but we do need to go back and think, oh, did I just do that interpersonal task too early for what my students were ready for? And maybe they do need more information in order to do the task that I'm asking of them. The last thing that I like to do before I do an interpersonal assessment is to do a fishbowl speaking activity. And so in that, they're in one half of the class is talking, and then the other half is their partner. Now, their partner is listening to what they're saying and giving them feedback on what they're saying. And so the biggest part here is to make sure that the partner has something that they can actually give them feedback on, because the partner can't fill out all of this. They're not ready for that. But their partner can tell them what words that they heard that they used that they thought were really great, or if they made a really good point. Or their partner can say like, oh, did you think about asking this question? And they can help formulate that question together. So they do that twice and then they switch roles. The other thing is I'm obviously there listening. And as it's a bigger whole class activity, I can give more feedback to the students as they're going. So a lot of times I won't necessarily fill out the top part as much, but I might be giving a couple checks here and then adding one or two things to give them my feedback too. So they're getting feedback from listening to all the other students and what's going on. They're getting this feedback from me. And they're also getting feedback from their peers. The other thing that I will say is I do have smaller classes, which makes it feasible for me to listen to everyone. But if that is too much, then it's easy. I would have someone else do the other half of the class do some sort of listening activity, so it's not as intimidating when the students are doing this. And then this feedback form I got from Amy Leonard, who has so many great ways to give quick feedback, which is what we're all looking for. So finally, the last mode is, what do I notice about presentational? So sometimes students have trouble elaborating with details or supporting their reasoning, just like they do in interpersonal. Sometimes they have difficulty circling around unknown words still in their writing. Sometimes they're asking for a lot of words. So I'll give a task to my student, they're like, and how do I say this? And how do I say this? And how do I say this? And sometimes they have trouble with organization. They're just spouting out random facts without actually organizing it. And then other times they have trouble connecting their ideas. So they're just writing, like I said, statement after statement instead of speaking statement after statement. So the next thing that I do is a lot of times before the actual presentational formative assessment, we need to do brainstorming and recall practice. Like, what words do you think you need? And sometimes let them look up one or two words that are important for them, but maybe not the whole class. They write them down and then they use that sheet of paper as something to do. And sometimes I'll also write words on the board as we're going over it. And that's also when we do the whole class brainstorming. So sometimes it's just them and they might share with a partner. And sometimes as a whole class, we're brainstorming on what they can do. And then, so this is, I shared, this is a chat mat that I used to give students as a reference. And so what I did is, as students, when we're building up to this, as students are asking me a lot of the same words, I'll put it on a chat mat and give it to them and give that as a reference. So I'm not having to come up with as much. And as they're seeing the same thing over and over, then they're able to use that. These next two I got from Greta Lundgaard at some of her presentations at Skolt and NECTFL this year. Letting students do some editing, but that can be difficult, especially for novices. So I loved this one. Giving positive feedback from their peers. So they share their favorite word that the student wrote, their favorite phrase, and their favorite sentence and why. And they don't have to do this in the target language. The nice thing about that is they're also seeing what someone else is doing. So maybe they're like, oh, they use that word and that would be good for me to use. Once students have trouble elaborating, have them do spider legs editing. And so what they'll do is I'll give them a fun colored sheet of paper. They'll write a new sentence on it that they could add, and then they'll cut it out and then they'll paste it onto their piece of paper wherever it would go. So again, if they're having trouble with organization or if they're having trouble with elaborating, this helps because it's another look at it, which I think I know, especially I don't always do as much as I should. Doing pair deck writing. So sometimes I'll give students a topic and have them write, and then we'll look at what they've written and I can give them feedback right away. Like, how could you say this word? Or could you add an extra detail on? And then the last thing is the same thing that I said with interpersonal. Sometimes students haven't had enough models with presentational and they're not actually ready for what they need to do. So maybe sometimes you think, oh, I just need to go back and give them more interpretive practice in order for them to be successful on this. So thank you so much. And I hope this has been helpful for you. On the resource sheet, I will also put my contact in case you want to reach out for me. And thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful summer and that you're resting, you're recuperating, and you're going to be ready for next summer.